Hi, and welcome to today's Engaging for Missouri webinar. I'm Alice Roach from the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri, and I'll be your host today. With each of these 30-minute webinars, we intend to share research-based insights that leaders like you can apply in your own work to benefit and strengthen the state's agriculture and food system, hospitality sector, and communities. Dr. John Kruse will present today's Engaging for Missouri webinar and describe how row crop producers may make use of the CFAP program. Before I invite him to begin, I want to share a few housekeeping items. First, we'll close the webinar today with a question and answer session. Those of you who connected to today's webinar via your computer can submit your questions in the chat screen. So to open the chat, just click the chat button that you see at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you joined today by phone, then you can email me your questions at roacham@missouri.edu. Second, all attendees are muted and may not start their video. Third, if you encounter any technical problems during today's webinar, then you can let me know by either submitting a comment in the chat screen, or you can also send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu, and I'll do my best to help you troubleshoot. Fourth, we will make a webinar recording available to you. You can look for an email in about a day from now that shares a link to that recording. Additionally, you can find an archive of all of our previous Engaging for Missouri webinars on our division's YouTube page. So with that, we'll transition to the topic of today's webinar, which is titled Using CFAP to Help Offset Price Declines for Stored Grain. Presenting today is Dr. John Kruse, who is an Associate Research Professor of Agricultural and Applied Economics in our division. So thank you, John, for presenting today. If you could please unmute your microphone, then we can begin today's presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Alice. I am going to jump right in here and talk a little bit about what's been happening with prices. We've gotten a lot of folks that have called about, what do I do with my grain that I have stored? How do I come out on this? What's going to happen as we look forward? And of course, you know, there's not a lot of guidance that we can give you given the situation with respect to COVID-19. And so one of the things I did want to talk a little bit about this morning was just how much you know, our government program's going to help us with trying to recover some of this loss. Normally, we expect when we look at corn and soybean prices to get a little bit of a bump somewhere in that March to May period, and it's just not happened this year. And so what do we do? What do we do? What can we do with the programs that are out there? I'm showing you a corn futures graph right here, and we can see one of the things just looking at it, that prices dropped from $4 a bushel all the way down. You know, if you look from about January to April, mid-April, somewhere around $3.30 a bushel. And so we all know, and we've lived this 65 to 70 cent price drop per bushel, and we can see the same thing occurring in soybeans. Now, if you look at that, you know, on a case of soybeans, we're dropping from about $9.40 a bushel back around mid-January to around $8.50. So that's about 90 cents or so, maybe 95, depending on where you pick the dates. So keep those numbers. That's how much we've lost in terms of prices as we've looked across January through mid-April. And the reason I pick out that period is because that's where the policy is focused on. What can we do to help producers compensate for this kind of unusual period of loss in corn and soybeans and other commodities, other row crop commodities, to help compensate and back up that income? And so that's what this program is about, and just to kind of give you a little background. So you may have heard this acronym CFAP. It's kind of all over the place now. It is an acronym that stands for Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. And it was first announced April 17th, but there weren't a lot of details. And so there was still a lot of hashing out going on behind the scenes exactly about how payments were going to be administered. And there's still a few details here and there that are a little fuzzy. And if you know some of those details, you're best to ask your Farm Service Agency folks about. If there's something that's really complex with the way you have marketed your grain and or have it stored or priced this year. So keep in mind there may be some questions that you're going to have to clarify with the local USDA FSA office. All of us are probably aware that there was about $19 billion in this relief program. $16 billion was in direct payments to agricultural producers, and about $3 billion for actually purchasing and delivering food directly from farmers to families in the Farmers to Families Food Box program. So one of the things that kind of makes it seem a little more complicated than it is that there is one payment from two sources. And so keep in mind that as you look at the payments that you're getting and the way they're calculated, part of the reason that they're split into two parts is because one is coming from funding that was provided through the CARES Act, and the second is really coming from the Commodity Credit Corporation, which is actually not so important to you maybe per se, but that's part of the background that sits behind why these payments are, why the calculations look more complex. So one of the things that is interesting about the program is what it's trying to do is compensate commodities where the prices have declined more than 5% between January 15th and April 15th, essentially. And so if we look for Missouri, the eligible commodities in the non-specialty crops, the focus of this, and of course, we're going to emphasize corn and soybeans today, but are really the malting barley, canola, of course, corn, upland cotton, millet, oats, soybeans, sorghum, sunflowers, durum wheat, and hard red spring wheat. Now, I wanted to point out, I've got it highlighted below in red, that the soft red winter wheat and hard red winter wheat are not included in the program. So just want to make sure that you knew that. And then you can see the livestock and specialty crops, which isn't the emphasis of this particular video, but they are also there in the program. So as we start to talk about this, one of the things that's kind of confusing is some of the language. They talk about a single payment based upon unpriced inventory as of January 15th. But then they go on to say, well, you're going to get 80% of that within 7 to 10 days of when you actually turn in the paperwork to get it. And then you're going to get 20% later if funds are available. So the single payment idea is basically trying to say, well, there's two different methods that we're going to use to calculate this, but then we're also still going to give you two payments because one is going to be in the next 7 to 10 days of when you file the paperwork, which you can do now. And then 20% is going to occur sometime later if we have funding available. So there are two calculations that are listed here. And what you need to think about this is very much focused on compensating producers for the effect of coronavirus on prices. And they're saying that effect occurred between, or at least the first tranche of that effect occurred between mid-January and April 15th. So what they're doing is they're saying, okay, any unpriced inventory that you had on hand, whether it was directly on your farm or stored in a grain terminal someplace, but anything that you had at risk on prices. In other words, you hadn't priced that grain yet. So if you use deferred pricing or, some sort of basis contract or some of that kind of stuff that didn't actually price the grain at the time, it would be eligible. It would be unpriced grain. So you can get on your unpriced grain, either up to 50% of your production or the lesser. So let me back up. It's the lesser of 50% of your production or what you had left unpriced as of the 15th of January. So that's the eligible production. And then that's going to be multiplied by 50% and then multiplied by the CARES actual payment rate. So let's look at some of those payment rates. Let's look at some of those let's look at an example. So right now, the USDA has put out specifically what the payment rates are under each of the different pots of money. So you have the CARES pot and you have the CCC payment pot. And so if you look at corn, for example, you can see it's 32 cents a bushel is the payment rate under CARES and 35 cents a bushel under the CCC payment rate. So what does that mean? Does that mean, how do we put that together and actually get into a payment? So I put together a simple example here to kind of show you what is happening. You know, this is just a corn example. So here's a situation where a farm produced 100,000 bushels of corn. Now they sold 40,000 bushels at harvest and they stored 60,000 bushels. And those 60,000 bushels were still in storage on January 15th. So if we look at the calculations, the first thing that happens is we need to calculate the production that's actually eligible for payments. So remember, it's going to be the minimum of 50% of the 100,000 bushels that were produced or the 60,000 bushels that were in storage. Well, we actually had, 60% of our crop in storage. Well, they will only cover 50% of that. And so our actual production that's eligible for payments is 50,000 bushels. Now let's look at the two payments, the two portions of the payment. The first portion is really the CARES payment, and that's the 50,000 bushel, the production that's eligible, multiplied by 50% times the 32 cents per bushel, which gives us $8,000 in this case. Now, the CCC portion of the payment is the same $50,000 or 50,000 bushels produced times 50% times the CCC payment rate. So that's $8,750. So you add those two up, and in this case, the total payment is $16,750. So there's an example for corn. Here's kind of the same idea for soybeans, and you could also extend it to the other crops that are covered. It all is kind of the same idea. In this situation, the farm produced 150,000 bushels of soybeans. We sold 100,000 bushels prior to January. And so we were left with 50,000 bushels in storage on January 15th. If you look then at how the payments are calculated, first we have to establish what production is eligible for payments. So we could get the minimum of 50% of the 150,000 bushels produced, or the 50,000 bushels that we had in storage. So 50% of 150,000 is 75,000 bushels, but we only had 50,000 bushels in storage. So we get the 50,000 bushels, not the 75. And then if you look at what the CARES payment portion would be, again, it's 50,000 bushels times 50%, and then times 45 cents per bushel, which is the CARES payment rate for soybeans. And then if we do which gives us then $11,250. We do the same thing for the CCC portion of the payment, and we get, again, 50,000 bushels times 50% times 50 cents per bushel. So that gives us $12,500. Add the two payments together, our total farm payment, our total payment for this particular situation would be $23,750. So the payment calculations are somewhat confusing because of the 50% here and there, but it's if you kind of keep it simple and you're looking at it and thinking about it from exactly where you're what you had stored and what you had unpriced at the time, that's probably really the most difficult part. The good news is that there is a little worksheet that you can download from the USDA site that actually shows you, that will actually do all the calculations for you. You just type in what you produced and how much you owned as of the 15th of January, and it will do all of these calculations for you in the background, and you can see what your estimated payments are. A lot of folks ask questions about, when do I get my payment? Well, the first 80% will come within 7 to 10 days after you turn in your application, and they're already taking applications. That started a few days ago, so you can submit that. Now the tricky part is, this is why I recommend using their Excel sheet. Download it, type in your data, and then you can print the forms that they want and either fax them or scan them, email them over to your FSA office, and then they can take it from there, and we'll clarify any questions that you have. One thing that some folks have asked about is payment limits. There are some payment limits attached to this. They're kind of similar to what you've been used to in the past. There are perhaps a few tweaks here and there with respect to corporations and limited liability companies, but there's some details on this slide, and you can also look at the website if you want to see more details on that. So I wanted to leave you here with a few places that you can connect to. One of the things is, if you want to read about the program, that first connection up there, that first link will take you directly to what's on the USDA website, as well as at that same spot is the CFAP payment calculator that's available in Excel. And just very quickly, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what that looks like. And so when you open up and click on the link to take you to the Excel spreadsheet, it's going to look something like this. And it's fairly easy to use. Depending on your security settings on your computer, you may have to enable the editing, and you may have to enable the macros. What the macros do is let you move around the sheet. They don't necessarily affect the actual functioning from what I've been able to tell so far. So it's very simple. You're going to type in your state and your county, and it's going to be pretty straightforward. I'm just going to pick on Marion County. And then you can put in your producer name and address and that type of thing. And then what you're going to do is come down here, and let's say if we were talking about corn, we go down and click on this commodity box and then just select corn. It's going to ask you, let's say our total production was 100,000 bushels and we had 50,000. Well, let's make it something more complex. Let's do 25,000 that weren't priced as of January 15th. And you can see it did the calculations for you. And so it's very simple, very straightforward. You can then print the various forms here. Those are right here. Those buttons are right here on the left side. So fairly straightforward. USDA has a really kind of a neat application here for calculating those. And you can see up here as you go through and put in your various crops, you're going to see the total change here. So that is available. There are some additional forms that are on here. Most of those, if you've been working with the Farm Service Agency, most of those forms will already be on file with them. And so that information should already be there. So with that, I'm going to stop and open it up and see if you have any questions.
Great, John. Thank you. If you do have a question, please go ahead and submit that in the chat screen, or you can also send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu. John, to kickstart our discussion, I'm wondering if you have an estimate of how much crop production, both in the U.S. and Missouri, that was subject to price risk on January 15th and would thus be eligible for these payments.
Sure. So one of the things, and what I'm showing you here is a spreadsheet. What we typically use to measure how much crop is unpriced at this time of the year, USDA gathers data on the percent of crop marketed by month. And so in Missouri at this time of year, the 5-year average is somewhere around 47.9% of our corn is actually marketed through the 15th of January. So that leaves basically 52% that's unpriced. For soybeans in Missouri, we have typically by January 15th about 43% that's left unpriced at that time. And that's very consistent with the national averages. Nationally, we have about 54% of corn that's unpriced as of January 15th and about 39% of soybeans. And so one of the things to keep in mind is that, when they design the program, the part of if you're looking at the average producer may have had, roughly 50% marketed by the 15th of January. Now, there is some debate about whether that actually happened this year, but because some company, the grain trading companies, were making the argument that farmers were holding on to more grain than usual. So we'll see how the data actually comes out, but generally that's about where we're at on average.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from an attendee asking whether there's a similar spreadsheet for livestock. I think that's referring to the USDA spreadsheet that was provided to help estimate those payments.
Sure. So yes, absolutely. If you go to the website, let me show you a very detailed website that FAPRI has up right now, and it's going to show you the. I can get to the right location. I apologize. It's got questions up there. So if you go and land directly on the FAPRI website, you're going to see a little button here that shows you where to go for COVID-19 Q&As. And if you click on the read more side, you're going to find all of these. You go down and you say, okay, let's look at the CFAP program. This particular section is going to show you all of the different payments for crops, livestock, different types, all of this detail. Peter Zimmel put together off of the program details. And so lots and lots of information out there on the FAPRI site for that. If you certainly have any questions, you're welcome to contact us, or, if it's a really detailed question about how exactly to make it work, you're probably well off with the Farm Service Agency.
Great, thank you. How are the payment rates per bushel determined for the CFAP and Commodity Credit Corporation payments?
Yes. Well, so if we go back to some of those very first slides in the presentation where we showed you those I'm going to just jump all the way back up here to the top. Remember when I talked about the decline in prices? Of corn being roughly somewhere in that 65 to 70 cent range, basically looking from right about here in January to about mid-April. If you take then the payment rates that we saw down here for corn and under the CARES and under the CCC payment rate, you add those together, well, they come up to about 67 cents, which, we said about a 65 to 70 cent price decline. And so what those rates are based on is the overall level of decline. Now, one comment I didn't make that I did want to tell you is that how much this is going to reimburse you for the price fall depends upon what percent of the commodity that you had stored on farm and what percent and how your basis has behaved over the period. So in some locations, like if you're on the river, your basis may actually be the same, may actually be narrower than it usually is, meaning that it's very, very close to the futures price. But in other areas, if you're up in the north western side of Missouri, your basis may be unusually wide because of some of the closure of ethanol plants and other factors. So that will have an impact on what percent are you being compensated for. If you were, let's say, about 90%, you carried about 90% of your crop forward, my calculations suggest that you're going to get compensated. So meaning that as of January 1st, you had about 90% of the crop in the storage. Between what this program will do between January 15th and April 15th will compensate you for roughly 20 to 25% of the loss. If you had 50% of your crop sold as of January 15th, it's going to get closer to covering 50% of your loss. But again, it varies a little bit depending upon what happened to your basis. So it's not going to fully make you whole, but it certainly helps better than having nothing.
Sure. So funding from CFAP intends to offset lower prices observed between mid-January to mid-April, like you explained. What's the likelihood that future payment programs could be announced at some point to offset losses that were incurred after that mid-April time?
Well, I think it's going to depend a little bit upon how prices move over the next few months and the pressure that the politicians feel to do more in terms of helping out agriculture. They certainly need to hear that message in terms of what you're experiencing out in the field. USDA, I know, wants to hear about that. And so as you're looking at your farm, or as you're working with farmers, for those of you who are working in the extension side, the real issue is to communicate and let folks know what the situation is. The likelihood, I think that's anybody's guess at this point in time. I don't think it, I would give it stronger odds, maybe perhaps than usual, simply because of the situation.
Great. Beginning on Tuesday of this week, that was the first time that producers could submit their applications. Have you heard anything about the extent to which producers have already applied?
I don't have any numbers on that. I apologize. I don't know the answer to that one.
Great. Farmers have also voiced some frustration about not being eligible for payments if their grain had been marketed or priced by that January 15th time. So in essence, they've sort of mentioned how they feel penalized for having a marketing plan. So what would you say to those producers who feel discouraged by that provision of this direct payments program?
Well, first of all, be glad you had a marketing plan and that you marketed before the 15th of January. As I mentioned just a second ago, this program is only going to come if you still had grain at the 15th of January or later. This program is only going to compensate you for part of the price loss. So be glad that you had it marketed before then, because you're coming out much better than if you had still had it in the bin and you got this, and now you're getting this payment that partially offsets that loss. The other thing, remember, is that this program is designed to address the impacts of coronavirus on markets, and so it's not really meant to be like a general subsidy program. And so you're really not necessarily, you're really not missing out on a subsidy per se, because you came out much better if you actually were marketed or had most of your crop marketed in early January.
Great, thanks for that. From what I understand, CFAP requires producers to self-certify that they're supplying the accurate information to USDA FSA. So in the event that producers are audited someday, what sorts of documentation should they make sure they have on hand to validate the data that they're reporting now?
Sure. So one thing that I like to use is the crop insurance forms that I fill out every year at the end of producing a crop. So there's a revenue plan loss estimator form that was for the your crop that you grew in 2019, and it's going to have on it documentation of exactly how much you produce. So that's one piece of information that's really helpful to have. Another one is if you have from your elevator, in terms of the 2019 crop, your receipts from what you did sell. And the receipts, sometimes I get a summary form at the end of the season that shows me all the different truckloads that were sold, and all those details, so I know exactly how much of that 2019 crop I had sold prior to January 15th. And so that is, and you're going to get, and some of you are going to have a lot more complex forms. You're going to have perhaps deferred pricing contracts. You may have other arrangements, but anything, you're going to want to have any type of form that shows, hey, I was still at price risk on this many bushels. In other words, I hadn't priced my grain as of the 15th of January for this many bushels, so that you can show this is what's available. So those are two things that I strongly recommend. You may also have other production reports that you've submitted with the Farm Service Agency, and that type of information. But those are kind of really what's key.
Excellent. Well, thank you, John, for sharing today's webinar presentation, and thank you to our audience too for joining us. When you exit Zoom today, you'll see a post-webinar survey will load in your browser. If you could please consider responding, we'll use the results to improve the webinar experience and also brainstorm future presentation topics. So again, you should receive a webinar recording later, well, tomorrow actually, via email. And then we'll wrap up this week's Engaging for Missouri webinars tomorrow as Kevin Johansson will present about Ag Butler. So thanks again for joining us and enjoy your Thursday. Thanks again, John.